Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. At least, that's what they call me. So I'm here to answer your questions about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, all of Tolkien's works, Tolkien himself, the themes, all the stuff that I have studied since the 80s. When I was a young boy. I was a young boy in the 80s, but I was very invested in it. I'd read The Hobbit in around 1987, I want to say. I was about 6 or 7 years old when I read The Hobbit. I was reading very young. And, and I was maybe about 10 or 11 when I read The Lord of the Rings, and from there it just blossomed, and I was reading The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit over and over again, and I discovered Unfinished Tales in my parents' bookshelf and read that, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And I want to say thank you to one commenter. I forget your name, but somebody said, because I mentioned last week, I believe, that I had been a Tolkien fan since the 80s. And somebody said, since the 80s, I thought you were like 30 years old. I'm like, thank you. I guess I have that kind of face. I'm actually 43 years old. I know I don't look 43 years old, but I am 43 years old. So I thank you. I will take that as a compliment. And before we get to anything, I also want to thank everybody who's subscribed, because we are close to our sub goal right now. We have a goal to hit 500 subscribers to sort of level up the channel, and we're at 398, which is about 40 more, give or take, than the last time I mentioned the subscriber count. So that's pretty great. That is really, really great. The channel's been growing. If you like it, please share it around. If you know anybody that's into Tolkien, bring them on over. Tell them that I not only answer questions, but I also do reading. And we're not going to read one of Tolkien's books today, but we're going to read a book about Tolkien, The Ring of Words, Tolkien and the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a wonderful book with 3 authors, Peter Gilliver, Jeremy Marshall, and Edmund Weiner. And I got this as a Christmas gift just this last Christmas from my friend Alice, and I just devoured this book. This book is wonderful because out of all the things about Tolkien that I love, the thing that I love the most is the linguistics, the way that, because Tolkien as a linguist and as a philologist was very concerned with the languages and that everything makes sense and is culturally appropriate. And he didn't write a story and then create languages for the story. He wrote the story to justify his languages. So this is a book about not only his usage of language and how it grows, but also his time spent as a young man working for the Oxford English Dictionary and researching the etymologies of words that start with W, and how he described it as like the toughest job he'd ever had, and that it was the most rewarding thing he'd ever done. And I'm going to read you the notes on 2 phrases that come up in The Lord of the Rings in Book 1. And they are 11D1 and gross. So to preface this, 11D1 refers to Bilbo's age. He was 111 years old, but when he said it, he didn't say, I am 111 years old. It is my 111th birthday. He said, I am 11D1 years old, and it is my 11th birthday, and that's quite an unusual way of saying it. It's not common. We don't say 11D1, we say 111. So we're going to get a little bit into that in this reading. And also gross. Now, gross is a term that refers to a dozen, 12 12s, or 144. And it's interesting because while Bilbo pretty much invites the whole of the Shire, and as well as people from outside the Shire, dwarves and such, for his big birthday bash, for his 11th birthday, he has a special sort of, I guess you could call it the VIP room, the pavilion, where there's special guests that are invited to hear his speeches and to eat like the very best foods and everything. And there were 144 guests, which he referred to as one gross, which actually offended a lot of the people there who felt like they were only invited to fill out a number, so to speak. And it's also curious because the sort of the double meaning of it. The term is a one gross, and the fact that people were offended by it because it's the sort of term that one uses for produce or for livestock, but never for people. And Bilbo knew that he was offending people by doing this. He was trying to offend people, certain people, by doing this. Not everybody was offended by it, just the people that he wanted to be offended. But it's interesting that it is one gross, and it is also a gross term. in that sense, a low term. And also, it's the 144 is important because it's Bilbo's age, 111 plus Frodo's age at the time, because Frodo has the same birthday as Bilbo, and he turned 33, and 33 is a very significant number for hobbits because they come of age at 33. Anyway, let's stop talking and start reading. Here we go. 11:1 engross. In the first chapter of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo is about to reach the age of 11:1, 111, a rather curious number, and at his birthday party, his announcement, "I am 11:1 today," is met with cheers from the assembled guests. In English, there are other invented terms for numbers representing tens, most famously umpty, which is now almost forgotten, but on which was based the very common word umpteen. It would be easy to see this as a piece of whimsical fancy based on Lewis Carroll logic. If we can count to 90, why not 11? But as always with Tolkien, the roots go deeper and are planted in the reality of the culture of the ancient world. In Old English, the next two tens after hund, or hundred, were hundenlufontig and hun-twelftig. The hund was a prefix, which also occurred in hun-detahig, 80, and hun-nigongting, for 90. If we remove the prefix, we get endlufontig, 11, from endlufon, or enleofon, 11, and 12tig, 12t. Why did the Anglo-Saxons count up to 12t? The answer lies in an ancient system of counting in 12s. Much later, at the end of the Middle English period, certain commodities, such as fish, were counted in hundreds that actually contained 60 or 120. And this was known as the Great Hundred or Long Hundred. From Oxford English Dictionary, hundred, noun, and adjective sense. This probably goes back to ancient times, is shown by the fact that is shown in the fact that in Old Norse 2 was tiutigr, or 10 tens. 110 was elufutigr, or 11 tens, exactly parallel to 11t, and 120 was hundrad, or 100. There are even said to be ordinal numbers titugandi and elufutugangi, 10th and 11th. Similarly, the Oxford English Dictionary shows that, from around 1400, many commodities were reckoned by the gross, which signified 12 dozen, or 144. We know that the hobbits use this reckoning from another place in the same chapter, where we are told that the invitations to the special family dinner party were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits one gross, although the word was not considered proper to use of people. Bilbo offends his guests later in the speech already referred to by doing just that. The party is even punningly described as an engrossing entertainment, though the sentence containing this phrase no longer contains the mention of 144 present in the early draft, and a reference to History of Middle-earth, Volume 6. So many readers miss the pun. Tolkien is imagining, as with many other matters, that the hobbits continue to practice used by our forefathers. But he presumably also knew that the Oxford English Dictionary has an entry for the similarly formed word 11, meaning 21, which was used by a 17th century writer named George Wither, and also revived in a Victorian farce by Charles Selby in 1858. It is also quite probable that he had come across this gloss for the Icelandic word elufu tiu in Cleesbu and Vigfussson's Icelandic English Dictionary. 11, 110, frequent in reckoning by duodecimal hundreds. Oh, that's the end. Then it goes into elf. Okay, an elf, that's a whole thing. The Eldar and the stars and all that. But I know that's not the usual sort of reading, but I really enjoy that book, and I enjoy the linguistic applications of Tolkien very much. Let's get to your questions. So we have 16 questions to get to today. This first question is a rather quick one. Could Sauron have created a new ring after Gollum destroyed the one he had? No, he couldn't do anything after the destruction of the One Ring. Most of Sauron's power was tied up in the One Ring. Once it was destroyed, he was left so impotent that he could never again regain power. Sauron was reduced to less than a shade or a wraith. He was just a malevolent wind. He could not even, at this point, regain physical form, much less create anything. So that was completely out of the question. And really, even if he could regain physical form enough to make a craft, making another ring, he had no power to pour into it. He poured the greater part, most of his power, into the One Ring, and it was destroyed. And as my friend Sid Kemp pointed out when we discussed this not too long ago, it wasn't enough. He poured most of his power into the One Ring, and it wasn't enough because the elves perceived him. They weren't fooled. They took off their rings of power. He didn't manage to control the dwarves because they're not really children of Iluvatar. He managed to ensnare men. 9 out of 19 rings of power got used in the way that he intended them to be used and controlled by the One Ring. It's not a great success. So he poured most of his power into the One Ring, but it wasn't enough. So with all that power gone, he's left with almost nothing. He could definitely not create another ring, and even if he could, it would not be anywhere near as powerful. It would really serve no purpose at all. Okay, next question. This one came in from Unseen Walker, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, are Anglachel and Anguriel made from Galvorn, or the meteorite metals aren't really related? Well, I guess you really mean from the Silmarillion, because this is not The Lord of the Rings, but I think that they're only slightly related, I would say. The swords were said to be made out of meteoric iron. Well, Galvorn seems to be derived from meteoric iron. It's an alloy of Eowyn's own creation, which he invented after spending some time learning with the dwarves. The only thing that he was said to specifically make out of Galvorn was his armor. So I would believe that the swords were probably iron, but iron of an exceptional quality, while his armor was made out of Galvorn. I would say they're only slightly related. And some people do just say, they sort of refer to all of Tolkien's works as The Lord of the Rings, even though it's not. It's the Silmarillion or whatever, but I get that. I understand that. Okay, next question. This is another quick one. What would have happened if Boromir had successfully taken the ring from Frodo? Could he have destroyed it? Well, he didn't want to destroy it. That's just the thing about it. Boromir would have found it extremely difficult to get the ring from Frodo, but if he managed to get the ring from Frodo, he certainly would not have been able to destroy it, and he didn't want to destroy it. The question is whether or not he would be able to use the ring, which of course he couldn't. At best, the ring might give him enough power to delude him into thinking he could challenge Sauron, and then it would betray him, and Sauron would recover his ring, and he would win the war. So, yeah, that wouldn't work out. Okay, next question. What is the reason behind Tolkien's use of the term Valar instead of gods for the deities in Middle-earth? Probably because they're not gods. They're not actually gods. The Valar are not gods, they're not demigods, they're not any sort of thing like that. Tolkien knew, though, that their function was similar to a pantheon of gods, as in the Greek or Roman pantheons. The Silmarillion even acknowledges that while they are not gods, people will call them that. Valar it means the powers, but it's Englished as gods. They're angels. They're angels of the highest order, the greatest in beauty and splendor and power. Valar is what the elves called them. The elves came up with the term because the elves name everything, and they named the top 15 angels, the Ainur, which means holy ones, Valar, and that means powers, because they are the powers that fuel the world. Okay, next question. Did Sauron ever visit Morgoth while he was imprisoned by the Valar? No. No, he couldn't. He was in Middle-earth. He stayed in Middle-earth the whole time, all the 3 ages that Morgoth, he wasn't even called Morgoth at the time, he was Melkor. The same character, though. But he hadn't gotten that name yet. Feanor had not called him that. For 3 ages he was imprisoned in Mandos, and that's in Aemon, and Sauron was in Middle-earth when Melkor was being dragged back to Valinor by Tolkien and Arome with a little help from Aule. It was mentioned that there were many things deep in the pits of Utumno, which was Morgoth's or Melkor's fortress, and Utumno, by the way, means hell. And there were a lot of things down there that escaped the Valars. Notice they didn't find the Balrogs, and it was mentioned that they went looking for Sauron, but they could not find him. Sauron's very, very good at hiding. So he wasn't able to have visiting hours with Melkor. He was hiding in Middle-earth, and he was preparing for his master's return. Okay, next question. Okay, this is a really interesting one. It came in anonymously, but I think it's an insightful question. Did Gollum feel affection for Frodo? I think he did. A little bit he did. Gollum was planning to lead Frodo and Sam to Shelob's lair near Cirith Ungol to be killed, so that she would eat them, and then he could pick through the clothes and the bones that are left behind and get back the One Ring, the precious. But that doesn't mean that he didn't feel conflicted about it. That's why we get scenes like Gollum arguing with himself. Gollum was treated better by Frodo than by pretty much anybody. Even the elves of Mirkwood, who treated him very well, they still kept him locked up. Frodo didn't do that. He did no such thing. He did tie him up at one point, but then he decided to untie him. Tolkien once spoke about a hypothetical situation where they weren't driven apart by Faramir, because Faramir warned Frodo about Gollum's treachery and about Cirith Ungol and what an evil place it is. And in this hypothetical scenario that Tolkien entertained, Gollum grew closer to Frodo, and he would still attack him, though. He would still attack him at Sammath Naur, and he would still take the One Ring from him. He couldn't help himself. He was too consumed by the ring. He really couldn't help that. That's beyond his power to change. But instead of trying to keep the ring, he would take the ring and he would destroy it. And you say, well, nobody could really destroy the One Ring willingly, but he would destroy himself. He would take himself with the ring. He would leap into the fire, and he would be destroyed, because his love for the ring is eclipsed by one thing: his hatred for Sauron. He hated Sauron, and he couldn't bear the thought of Sauron getting the ring, for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, Gollum was a pretty nasty character. He wasn't a good person, but there are a lot of little things that you see in the text that point towards a redemptive arc for him. And that's why, in the end, after the ring is destroyed, when Frodo and Sam are exiting Sammath Naur, Sam is sort of like, wow, that Gollum, man, he came back and he did it again. He attacked us again. And Frodo says something like, yes, but he's gone now, so let's forgive him. And that's very much in Frodo's personality, you know. Okay, next question. If Boromir had lived, would he have married Éowyn? No. The marriage between Boromir's brother Faramir and Éowyn, it wasn't some political arrangement. They fell in love. They were both recuperating from their respective ills and wounds in Minas Tirith. During the final battle, Boromir being alive doesn't mean that he has first dibs on the new King of Rohan's sister. It doesn't work that way. Aside from all that, Boromir wasn't interested in women or marriage at all. He was married to his country, married to his sword, as it were. And this was something that Tolkien described as being not terribly uncommon with Númenórean men. Even though he's a man of Gondor, he's a Dúnedain, a descendant of the men of Númenor, just like Faramir, just like Denethor, of course, his brother and his father, and just like Aragorn, the Sea Kings of old were their ancestors. And there were just like a certain type of men of Númenor that were just not interested in women. They were not interested in marriage. They had no sort of romantic proclivities whatsoever. The modern term that we would use for this would be either asexual or aromantic. But back then it was just sort of known as somebody who was married to his country, married to his sword, somebody who just was so consumed by the love for what he does as a person, that he doesn't really have room in his heart for another person. And if somebody like that marries anyway, it could sort of lead to disaster. Taraldarian was a king of Númenor who married a woman that was very deeply in love with him, named Arendis. She was very deeply in love with him, and he really didn't feel the same. There was a point where he kind of had some affection for her. It was sort of like, well, I guess I love her a little, I'll marry her. I got to marry somebody. Might as well be her. And it was a disaster because the true love in his life was not her. It wasn't even Númenor. It was Middle-earth. He loved to travel to Middle-earth. He would make these large ships, and he would sail off to Middle-earth, and he would meet elves and all sorts of people, and he would find forests full of trees that he could use to make more ships, and he just loved it. He would be like, I'm going off again. And he had a daughter and that he barely knew because of this, and he wound up getting basically a divorce. He came home one day, and his wife basically told him, we're not married anymore. We're done. I pretty much hate you now after all you've put me through, because she did love him, and he didn't really feel the same. He loved Middle-earth. Middle-earth was the only woman in his life that he cared about. So Boromir was very much like that. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think Éowyn would have liked him very much, to be honest with you. She liked Aragorn, she liked Faramir, she wouldn't have liked Boromir, I don't think. Okay, next question. What happened to the Nazgûl after they were swept away by the river in The Lord of the Rings? They were scattered, and more importantly, they lost the horses. The horses were, for the most part, killed by the flood. This is important because the Nazgûl can't see very well. Everything that they see is dark and blurry to them, especially people. And the horses actually did most of the seeing for them. This is why, in a much earlier scene in Book 1, when one of the Black Riders, the Nazgûl, gets off of his horse, and he's sort of coming for the hobbits, he gets low to the ground and starts sniffing, because he can't really see all that well. He's sniffing after the hobbits. This is also why they use their magic to compel the ring bearer, of course it was Frodo, to don the One Ring. And why whenever Frodo was around the Nazgûl, the Black Riders, he felt the urge, the very strong urge to put the ring on. Because when he does that, to our eyes, he seems to become invisible. He vanishes. But what's actually happening is he's being drawn into their world, which most people can't see. But once he's drawn into their world, they suddenly can see him clear as day. He stands out, and that's how they identify which of these halflings has the One Ring, which is the one that we have to capture. The Witch King managed to find the one horse that survived the flood, and he rode down to Mordor, and he was given additional demonic power by Sauron. And then he used that to go back and gather all the Nazgûl together and lead them to Mordor, where they were given new mounts, the Nazgûl birds that are often referred to as fell beasts. Okay. Next question. Why didn't Gandalf agree to join Saruman so that he could escape and help Frodo and his companions instead of being trapped at Isengard? So I see what you're getting at there when Saruman says, you will be stuck here until the end, and maybe Gandalf could say, you know what, I've given it some thought, and you're right, we should join forces, we should do this, and then just get out of there, The issue with that is that Gandalf is not a liar. Gandalf was honest. He would not lie. Not even for what you would call the greater good. This is really important. This is really getting down to the morality of Tolkien. Doing a bad thing for the greater good is what led to Sauron's fall. It's what led to Saruman's fall. It's what led to Feanor's fall. And it's why some characters like Aula and Galadriel teetered on the brink. Tolkien is very clear in the morality of the situation. You cannot do a good thing by evil means, and lying is evil. If you notice in The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring is destroyed by a deception on the part of the heroes, but it was an indirect deception. No one lied to Sauron. They allowed Sauron to jump to conclusions. Pippin did not say that he was the ring bearer. Aragorn did not claim to have the ring in his keeping at Minas Tirith. Both of them were honest and allowed Sauron to come to these conclusions on his own. Saruman, as a point of comparison, he tried to lie to Sauron and pretend to join him so that he could get into his good graces and he could trick him, and eventually he could usurp him and take over. Sauron was not fooled. He let Saruman do his thing because it was convenient for him. Gandalf would make a very bad liar anyway, just like Bilbo. Bilbo was a very honest person, and when he told the story about how Gollum planned to give him the ring as a prize in the riddle contest, and then he couldn't find it, so Bilbo asked to be let out instead, and Gollum said, "Okay, I'll let you out," and they let him out of the mountain. Gandalf, as soon as he heard this, he knew it was a lie. Even if he fooled Thorin and the rest, he didn't fool Gandalf. Gandalf explained later that because Bilbo was so honest, he was not accustomed to lying. He was bad at it. Gandalf would not be able to fool Saruman any more than Saruman was able to fool Sauron. Okay, next question. Do people who have read the Silmarillion tend to skip over parts from The Hobbit when they reread it too often because it's just not interesting enough compared to The Lord of the Rings? Okay, so when I first read this question, I was a little confused by it. I didn't understand what reading the Silmarillion has to do with skipping parts of The Hobbit and comparing it to The Lord of the Rings. It's sort of worded in a strange way, but I think I can see where you're coming from on this one. I do think that there are some Tolkien scholars and high-level fans that have delved very deeply into the Silmarillion, into Unfinished Tales, into the history of Middle-earth, into the nature of Middle-earth, and they might sort of dismiss The Hobbit. That's a mistake. The Hobbit is too important of a story to just gloss over just because it's on a smaller scale. Going to The Hobbit after reading the Silmarillion is actually a very illuminating experience. One doesn't realize how much lore The Hobbit actually has unless you've read the Silmarillion. But I digress. Let me tell you a quick story. And I'm sorry if I've told the story on YouTube before, but it's one of my favorites. So I'm going to tell it whether I've told it or not in the past. I read this tale on Tumblr about a meeting of the Tolkien Society. This was written as a first-hand account of the events, but it was not corroborated by anybody else, so it might be apocryphal. I don't know if it's true or not, but it does illuminate the point that I'm making. Somehow, in this story, the Tolkien Society got into an argument about whether or not bees existed in Middle-earth. There was a rather heated debate back and forth about whether or not bees existed in Middle-earth, and it was said to have lasted upwards of 6 hours. The conclusion of the debate came from one person pointing out that linguistically, Meduseld, which is the home of Théoden, king of the Mark, translates to mead hall, and the existence of a mead hall suggests the existence of mead. And the existence of mead suggests the existence of honey. And of course, if you have honey, you have bees. Now, case closed, right? Now, I guess it could also have been pointed out that mead was mentioned more directly in Lothlorien, but hey, at least they got there, right? Now, if any of the scholars present had recently read The Hobbit, they would have remembered that Beorn kept bees. Honey was mentioned, of course, as a staple of his diet, and it was served to Gandalf and Thorin and Bilbo and all the other dwarves, but they mentioned that he kept bees. So how did so many intelligent people forget this? Simple. Well, I'm sure that every single person there had read The Hobbit. It was probably not something that they came back to very often, so they forgot the details. This led to a completely pointless 6-hour debate that did nothing for anybody. It was a gigantic waste of time. they likely also completely ignored Tolkien's Tales from the Perilous Realm, in which Bilbo wrote poems about giant bees called Dumbledores. Dumbledore is an old English term that just means bumblebee, but if there was no actual bees in Middle-earth, then why would Tolkien write a fantasy poem about giant bees? There's no frame of reference, because he would have to explain what a bee is. And in the poem that he writes about the Dumbledores, he doesn't explain what a bee is. He explains that a Dumbledore is a giant bee, but that's about it. It is also largely believed that Bilbo's whimsical fiction may have been from his first visit to Rivendell, where he might have mistook the tales that the elves told him about the First Age being fairy stories and not really things that happened in their history. So he decided to write sort of similar stories and his own whimsical take on it. And he decided to include giant bees. And if he didn't know what a bee was, why would he come up with that? So I fully believe that, there are some people out there that sort of see themselves as above studying The Hobbit. And it's in my opinion, fully to their detriment, because there's a lot to be learned in The Hobbit. It's not as complicated of a work as The Lord of the Rings, and certainly not as complicated as the Silmarillion, but it is still an important work, and it's still a great story. There's more there than you think there is. Okay, next question. This one came in from Peter Ramirez, who asks, Gandalf told Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he. What were these things, and how could they be older than Sauron? So I can't really cover what are they, because they're nameless. That's the whole point of it. They're nameless things. They don't have a name. We don't know anything about them. But I can get into how could they be older than Sauron. That's the interesting part of the question. That's the part that actually can be answered. Older is a very tricky term. We have to remember that Gandalf is sort of obfuscating a little bit to speak simply. Sauron, as one of the Ainur, was one of the first beings created by Iluvatar, and he predates the existence of the world with a capital W, meaning the universe. That being said, it seems impossible that anything within the circles of the world could be older than Sauron. If he predates the world, how can anything in the world predate him? And it seems that Gandalf, in this case, simply misspoke. And one might think, because he is also one of the Ainur, he should have known better. However, there's a major caveat to all this. With the creation of the world, the capital W world, Ea, the universe, within the circles of the world, the planet Arda, something else was created. The concept of time. Outside of Ea, in the void, is the timeless halls where Iluvatar dwells and where the Ainur dwell. Some of the Ainur decided to live in Ea, which is a physical manifestation of their music. Like a song, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. So too will the world end, and this is counted by the passage of time. So, though time itself was not measured in the world until the creation of the two trees, concepts such as older don't really apply to anything before creation. So, what did Gandalf mean when he said that there are things deep in the earth that don't have names that are older than Sauron? We can't really be sure, but my interpretation would be that he means they were in the world before Sauron was. We know that there are creatures in Arda that were there before the Ainur came into it. Tom Bombadil is one such creature. He was old when the world was young. He was there before the first raindrop and the first acorn. My own theory has always been that Tom is a spirit born of the secret fire, which was imparted into the center of creation by Iluvatar, who is God, and it was not until this secret fire was put into the world that the Ainur made the decision to come to the world. So it seems what Gandalf is getting at is the things deep below the earth, whatever they are primordial spirits or creatures existing in the world since creation, and they were there before the Valar and the Maiar came to this world. This would mean that they are older than Sauron or any of the other Ainur in the sense of time and how it relates to the world, even if they were created after Sauron. So that's how I choose to see it. Okay, next question. Will the Silmarillion ever reach the same level as popularity as The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit? No, not a chance at all. The Silmarillion was a bestseller, and it was a very popular book, but the difference between the Silmarillion and its popularity and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and their popularity is like the difference between shooting a bullet and throwing a bullet. You know, it's not close. This is simply because the Silmarillion is not a novel. The Silmarillion doesn't tell a cohesive story from beginning to end. That's partly due to the fact that it was not really finished, but mostly it's by design. The Silmarillion was meant to be the keystone work of Tolkien's Legendarium, and all the other stories are more detailed accounts of the stories in the Silmarillion. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings comprise a single chapter in the Silmarillion called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. The Silmarillion is a chronicle, a collection of lore that is more of a history of Tolkien's world than a story told within it. So by this virtue alone, it would never reach the heights of popularity that The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings enjoy. Even The Children of Húrin, released as its own novel and quite possibly Tolkien's best story in the entire Legendarium, it didn't stand a chance. It was far too long after the release of the last novel. It was far too long after the author's death. It was hurt by these very sort of cynical and, dare I say, moronic critics who, at the time, while they were praising the story for being good, they sort of slammed the idea that it was released at all because they were being very cynical, and they were saying it's a cash grab. It's only there to make a new movie, which is ridiculous because where's our Children of Húrin movie? It never happened. None of the stories from the Silmarillion, other than Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, have ever been... and not even that, because that's not the Lord of the Rings. It's a version of the Lord of the Rings. But they've never sold the rights to the Silmarillion or any of its stories to make movies out of it. So, yeah. But let me just, you know what? I think a practical, my books are too far away. Never mind. Maybe one time I'll give you a practical demonstration. But I'm going to read a little bit of the very first paragraph of The Hobbit, the very first paragraph of the Lord of the Rings, and then the very first paragraph of the Silmarillion. Actually, I can do it because I have digital copies on my computer here. And just to give you a stylistic standpoint and how you're drawn into a story or not drawn into a story, as the case might be. Well, here's The Hobbit. Hold on, I do have digital copies here. Okay, so I'm going to give you the first first two paragraphs of The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. This door opened to a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floored tiles and carpeting, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all people for many miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes, he had whole rooms devoted to clothes, kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows, looking over his garden, and meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. So you're not really getting the story yet, but you're getting a very good description. You sort of like... you don't know what a hobbit is just yet, because that comes a little bit later, but you learn that he lives in a hole, and that seems very strange, and it's sort of this whimsical, it has a round door, and the knob is in the center, and there's all these rooms, but it's all on one floor. It's drawing you into it by being fantastical, because people don't really live like this, and this is very unusual. So you're interested, you want to learn more. It draws you in because it's getting you invested in the world created. Now over to the Lord of the Rings. Here's my digital copy. Okay. So I'm gonna give you the same thing, the first two paragraphs. How'd that happen? When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since the remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folks might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved. But unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth, as well as reputably inexhaustible wealth. So once again, you're drawn in. You can tell it's a sequel when you read the first bit of The Hobbit and the first bit of The Lord of the Rings back to back like that. You're drawn in. Bilbo's the focal character, and it's going to transition over to Frodo, but you don't know that yet. And, you're learning that he's very old, but he doesn't appear to be old. And we're like, well, why is that? You don't know yet. We know it's the ring, but we don't know that yet if you're reading it for the first time. And we're getting these descriptions of the people of the Shire, and it's sort of a different take on it. Instead of focusing on what we may already know about Bilbo, here's some new things about Bilbo. So then let me get over to the Silmarillion. So this is for comparison, and this is why, even though the Silmarillion is one of the greatest of Tolkien's works, and is certainly his most important work, and a very rewarding work to read, it can be a difficult task to read through it. So I'm going to give you the first, I'm going to do 3 paragraphs because they're a little shorter, of the Silmarillion. There was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought. And they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or a few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grow but slowly. Yet ever as they listened they came to deeper understanding, and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Ilúvatar called together all the Ainur, and declared them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed, for the glory of his beginning and the splendor of his end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Ilúvatar and were silent. Then Ilúvatar said to them, Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning his theme, each with his own thoughts and devices if he will. But I will sit and hearken and be glad, though you great beauty has been wakened into song. So there's 2 things is very different because it's almost like reading the Bible. It's biblical in its style. It's like first there was God and he created the angels, and and it's also very fast. Dialogue is there right away. Already God is speaking. He's saying things, and it's getting right into it. And that is the issue with the Silmarillion for a casual reader, is that it goes through so many events so quickly, and you're given a whirlwind of names and concepts and devices and lands and genealogies and everything. It all goes very, very, very fast. It's not as detailed. It's not as described. We hear about Ilúvatar, who is God, but we don't know what he looks like. We don't know what he's all about. He made the Ainur, the holy ones, the offspring of his thoughts, but we don't know any of their names or what they're all about. We get that a little bit later in a section called Valaquenta. But even then, it's very, very quick and very, very brief, and it just rolls through the events very quickly. So it's a difficult read. It's a challenge to read, and it's never going to be as popular as The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. I spent a lot of time on that. But the next 2 questions, which together comprise the thumbnail question. So I'm going to read you what both of these questions are, and then I'm going to sort of try to answer them together if I can. So the first question is Is it necessary to read The Hobbit before The Lord of the Rings, or can it be read as a standalone book? And the second question is it necessary to read the Silmarillion before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? If not, when is the best time to read it? So taking these two questions and sort of combining them into one, the real question is, what is the order to read Tolkien's works in? So sort of like concentrating first on the first question, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Obviously, The Hobbit was written well before The Lord of the Rings. It was published in the 30s, whereas The Lord of the Rings in the 50s. And The Lord of the Rings is a sequel to The Hobbit, but many people just go right to The Lord of the Rings because they're adults or young adults, as the case may be, and they hear that The Hobbit is sort of a children's tale, and they don't really I don't want to read like a kid's book. So let's talk about that whole concept. None of Tolkien's books require you to have read any of his other books. Unless we're talking about The Lord of the Rings as being 3 separate volumes. You wouldn't want to start with The Two Towers or The Return of the King. The Lord of the Rings is really one book, and it should be treated as one book. But I recommend you start with The Hobbit, regardless of what anyone says about it being written for children. It's a misleading statement. It was written for everybody, children included. The Hobbit is not for children. It is suitable for children. That being said, there's nothing wrong with skipping to The Lord of the Rings if that's what you wish, but I don't recommend it. I really don't. The Lord of the Rings does sort of start off with a recap of The Hobbit. You sort of the first couple of paragraphs that I read there, and it does go into what happened to Bilbo and everything. In the forward, in the prologue before that, even, it says, okay, well, this is what a Hobbit is, and this is what Bilbo did, and now you're up to date. But there's a great story there, and I spoke about this earlier, about how you don't want to dismiss The Hobbit because it actually is important. A lot of the themes that are present in The Hobbit are present in all of Tolkien's works. Getting into the Silmarillion, some people will say, well, we should start with the Silmarillion because it's a prequel, it happens before. And it's sort of like, it's difficult because it's sort of a C.S. Lewis thing. C.S. Lewis, of course, he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and he didn't write them in chronological order. I mean, he did write them where, the first few books were in chronological order, but then he wrote a prequel, which I believe was called The Magician's Nephew. And some versions of it, if you get in like a box set or even some separate volumes, will put that as the first book, even though it was published later. And C.S. Lewis didn't necessarily think that you should read that one first. Sometimes it will be labeled as book 1, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe labeled as book 2. And this sort of came from a letter that a child sent to C.S. Lewis, who just mentioned that they like to read it in that order, in the chronological order. And C.S. Lewis said, well, it's fine if you want to read it that way. It's perfectly acceptable. And there were some people that sort of took this as him endorsing that that's the correct way to do it. It's not, because if it was the correct way to do it, he would have written it that way. And it's also not the correct way to do it for another reason. There's no correct way. You could read it in any way you want. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a grand time. The Silmarillion, though, please don't do this. Please don't read the Silmarillion before you read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. It might be a prequel in the sense that the majority of the events are long before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But I always recommend against this whole reading the prequel first or watching the prequel first in media. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. Somebody told me about their father was watching the show, one of my favorite shows of all time, Better Call Saul, who had never watched Breaking Bad, which Better Call Saul is a prequel to. And I said, that's not the right way to go about it. You shouldn't do that, because even though it's a prequel, it's designed for people that had watched Breaking Bad, and you're going to miss a lot. Doing the entirety of Tolkien's Legendarium in chronological order or anything, it's not recommended for first read. especially in the case of the Silmarillion. Like, if you wanted to say, well, I'd like to watch Breaking Bad and Better Call, I want to watch it in chronological order. If you have already watched it all, go ahead, do that. That's great. But for somebody who's just getting into it, do it in the order that it came out. The Silmarillion has the entire plot of Lord of the Rings in a single chapter, as I mentioned earlier, of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And it's just one chapter at the end. It's a little different, obviously. It's a lot different because it's condensed. It's very, very fast. It goes through everything very quickly. And, it's told from Elrond's perspective as well, so it's completely different in that sense. But the Silmarillion, as I mentioned, is not a novel. It's not a story. It's a chronicle. It's a collection of lore. It touches on many stories. It was intended to be an outline of Tolkien's Legendarium, with many of the stories were able to support their own novels, the more detailed accounts. It just happened that the Lord of the Rings came out first. He wanted to release the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings together as the saga of the Three Jewels and the Rings of Power, but his publisher wasn't so interested in that. That being said, what is the order you want to read it in? Obviously, start with The Hobbit. Start with The Hobbit. It's important. Read it. It's a delightful book. Yes, it's a bit of a children's novel in that sense, but that doesn't take anything away from it. Tolkien had a very different idea of what a children's novel should be than what you might think a children's novel is. The Lord of the Rings next. Then in this case, you could go sort of one of two paths. You could go to the Silmarillion, or you could go to Unfinished Tales. I personally recommend reading parts of Unfinished Tales first. Unfortunately, I moved my books because I was vacuuming in here and they're a little far out of my reach. But I do have a digital copy that I'm going to bring up, not to read from Unfinished Tales, but to sort of demonstrate what I'm speaking of, that the Unfinished Tales has several different sections. There's a first age section, a second age section, a third age section, and then sort of a miscellaneous section. So the first age section has Of Turin is coming to Gondolin, and it has the Tale of the Children of Húrin. These should be read sort of alongside the Silmarillion. Of Turin is coming to Gondolin is the beginning of a retelling of the fall of Gondolin, and it's unfinished, but it's a really wonderful tale that gives you some very detailed accounts of Turin's journey that were not, in the Silmarillion, or parts of it that were in the Silmarillion were not very detailed. He was fleshing it out into a greater work that unfortunately he didn't finish. And when you read Of Turin is coming to Gondolin, you can tell what I'm talking about. It's a very wonderful story. The Tale of the Children of Húrin, the first part's in Unfinished Tales, the second part is in the Silmarillion, the third part is in Unfinished Tales. So you kind of want to read those together. The second age stuff is mostly information about Númenor and Galadriel and Celeborn. You could read this right after the Lord of the Rings, right after the Silmarillion. It really doesn't matter. The third age section, though, I recommend that as soon as you finish reading the Lord of the Rings, crack open a copy of Unfinished Tales, skip right to the third age story, and read The Hunt for the Ring and The Quest for Erebor, and they're going to help you flesh out the ideas of the Lord of the Rings, and they're basically parts of the Lord of the Rings that are not in the Lord of the Rings. The fourth section, I also recommend reading that right away because it's information about the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones that, Denethor had one, and Saruman had one, and Sauron had one, and there's information about the Astari, the wizards, that you won't find in the Lord of the Rings and you won't find in the Silmarillion. And then read the Silmarillion alongside the rest, the first stage stuff. Then after that, if you feel like continuing, there is the history of Middle-earth and the nature of Middle-earth and all that. Optional. That's if you want to be a Tolkien scholar, if you really want to learn about everything. But if you want more fiction, get the Tolkien Reader. It has The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. It has Farmer Giles of Ham. I called it Giles last week. That was a mistake, my friend. Farmer Giles of Ham. It has... I think Roverandum's in there. I'm not sure. There's some great stories in there. Leaf by Niggle is a fantastic little story, little allegory about Tolkien's creative process. He's got great translations of Beowulf and the Green Knight. So, yeah. That's really all I have to say about the order to read things. I wanted to sort of combine those two into one big question about the order to read everything. Okay, next question. This one came in from Brian Yankee, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, why did Aragorn stop Théoden from killing Wormtongue and instead allowed him to escape? Wasn't that a strategic error, considering Wormtongue's known allegiance to Saruman? So this is a question that is specific to Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings film series, and I know that because that didn't happen in the book. But it's worth bringing up the book anyway for this question. In the book, Théoden did not want to kill Gríma Wormtongue. He didn't want to hurt him at all. Gríma had been denying the charges of working with Saruman and insisting that he was still loyal to Rohan. So, to prove his worth, Théoden offered that he would be fully pardoned and forgiven if he did just one thing: ride out to war with his king against Saruman. Gríma was cowardly and refused. Instead, he ran away. Théoden yelled out to his guards, don't stop him, don't harm him, give him a horse if he wants one. And Éomer had a snarky comment, if a horse will bear him. So, because that's the way it played out in the book, the story demands that Gríma has to leave and go back to Saruman. In changing Théoden's reaction to wrath and wanting to kill the man, someone has to intervene to stop him from doing that so that the story doesn't go off the rails, and Aragorn made perfect sense for that. It was definitely not an error to save Gríma Wormtongue in the book and in the movie, regardless of how it wasn't an error in the book for Théoden to wish for Gríma to be left alone, to leave if he will, and in the movie it was not a mistake for Aragorn to stop him from killing him, because in both the book and the movie, Gríma Wormtongue ends up killing Saruman at different points in the story. In the Lord of the Rings films, it was at Orthanc, and at the beginning of the Return of the King, and in the extended edition at least, and in the books it was the end of the Return of the King during the Scouring of the Shire. But what's really important, though, is that in both the movie and the book, Gríma throws the Palantir out of the tower. Without this Palantir, Pippin doesn't contact Sauron. The Dark Lord doesn't come to believe that Pippin is the ring bearer. Aragorn doesn't get to fool Sauron into believing he has the One Ring, and he does not successfully goad the Dark Lord into attacking before he's really ready to attack, ensuring that he does not build up enough strength in his army to just crush Gondor, and also emptying out Mordor of his armies, which made it a lot safer for Frodo and Sam, because that's the real story, is Frodo and Sam. They're what's important. The war is a distraction. So, like Gollum, who had a part to play in the end, Frodo said at the very beginning of the story, it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill that guy. And Gandalf said, but pity is what stopped him. And Gandalf was very smart about this. He was very, very wise. He says, Gollum has a part to play, and he will play it before the end. And Gríma is very much the same. So you're kind of, in this sense, you're kind of taking the role of Frodo, and I'm taking the role of Gandalf, where you're saying, well, it's a shame that they didn't kill that Wormtongue guy. That was kind of a mistake. I said, but look at what came from that. The Dark Lord lost, and he had a part to play just as Gollum did. So, yeah, it wasn't a mistake. Okay, last question. 1 second here. Okay. All right, last question. What Tolkien character do you like the most outside of the known characters in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? You may include characters left out or added into the movies. So, this is a good one for me. I recently wrote a 42-page paper on Tuor. So I would say that it's definitely Tuor. The Children of Húrin is my favorite Tolkien story, but I have to admit, there aren't really likable characters in The Children of Húrin. I mean, there are two. Both of the female leads are likable characters, and they both die. One is nailed to a tree by some orcs, and the other commits suicide. It's a rough story. My second favorite tale, though, is The Fall of Gondolin. And my fascination has always been with the hero of The Fall of Gondolin, Tuor. Tuor is the most important character in Tolkien's mythology. Everything from him, everything from before him, leads to him in extremely direct ways. And then from him flows everything else. He's the linchpin of the whole story. There is hardly a character in The Lord of the Rings among men and elves that don't have a direct or an indirect connection to Tuor. So, if you need the quick rundown of who he was, Tuor was a man who met one of the Valar, became his messenger and champion, and he was the savior of elves and men during the Fall of Gondolin. He was the only fully mortal man with no elvish ancestry whatsoever to be made immortal. And he's also Elrond's grandfather. So I've been fascinated by him ever since I mentioned this way early in the video. In my early teens, I discovered a copy of Unfinished Tales in my parents' bookshelf. And that had the first bit of Tolkien's last version of The Fall of Gondolin, of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, which is just, I wish he would have finished that version of The Fall of Gondolin. That would have been even better than The Children of Hurin, I think. He was gearing up for a real epic, like on the same level as The Lord of the Rings and The Children of Hurin. It would have been amazing. It's a shame he didn't finish it, but that's the nature of Tolkien's work. Most of it's not finished. You know, The Hobbit was finished. The Lord of the Rings sort of finished, but Tolkien was unhappy with the state that it was in during its publication. He thought it was too short. The appendixes were not good enough. He wished he would have had more time, and that he spent more time on it. Of course, C.S. Lewis was there saying, give us a story. Come on, give us a story. He was the midwife in that situation. But anyway, guys, if you got all the way through this video, you know what I'm going to say, right? If you got all the way through this 1 hour and 2 minutes of me rambling about Tolkien's work, talking about Tuor and Gríma Wormtongue and Gollum and all this stuff, you got all the way through it and you didn't click the like button? Come on, click the like button, click the subscribe button if you haven't already, and tell people about the channel. The goal right now, as I said earlier, the goal is 500 subscribers, and we are getting there. Okay, I think I might have to do something special for 500 subscribers. I don't know quite what it's going to be yet, but when I reach 500 subscribers, I'm going to have to do something special. I'm going to have to give that some thought. But anyway, guys, we'll see you next time. Send me some questions. My Quora is in the description, or you can just leave a comment. If you want to be featured in a video, the best way to do it is through Quora. If you want just a direct answer, comments are fine. We'll see you guys next time.